And now I'd like to do a little demonstration to cement that idea in your minds. And for that, I need a volunteer. All right, there we go. Whoops. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go prospecting for oil. And we've got two kinds. We've got, these are food-grade materials, incidentally, no crude oil, and no oil wells were injured in the production of this demonstration. So this is not C for cola and UN for uncola. This is conventional oil. This is what we're living on now. And this is the unconventional. And I mentioned one example of that. The tar sands are really unconventional oil. So first, our lovely volunteer is going to try and extract some conventional oil and then tell us about it.
Tastes like root beer.
Okay. Hang on. All right, tell us.
It tastes like root beer.
Root beer, okay. So it's sweet, it's fizzy, and how about getting it out?
Not difficult at all.
Not difficult at all. It comes right out, flows right out. It's that bubbling crude that you see in the Beverly Hillbillies. Am I dating myself? You can see the reruns on Nickelodeon if you haven't seen this. Okay. So that's what we've been living on, conventional oil that flows like a liquid, it comes out of the ground, easy to get, and that fizziness is the natural gas that's often associated with it, that's dissolved in it. Okay, now here's the unconventional stuff. How are we doing?
Nothing's coming out of the straw.
Okay, I'm going to give you a little help on this. Now, I think we have to pull off the overburden, okay? And we got to get down to where the unconventional oil is, okay? Now, how does it taste?
Like sour cream.
Okay, okay. So it's kind of gooey and it's sour. And it turns out that the stuff that we're running the world on now is called light sweet crude, so this is why I used root beer. And as a reward, you can drink the rest of the conventional oil if you want to. And the stuff that we're going to be using go ahead. Let's thank our volunteer here. The stuff that we're going to be powering, the oil that we're going to be using is harder to get, thicker, doesn't flow in many cases as well as we'd like it to, and it's sour. What does that mean? It's sour. That means it has a lot of sulfur in it. In fact, oil used to be graded by taste, if you can imagine that. They don't do that anymore because the light sweet crude tasted sweet and the sour crude tasted sour because it had a lot of sulfur in it. So we've got to take that sulfur out. That's more energy that it takes to refine it. That's less energy available to society. So that tells you what's happening with those hard-to-get resources and their flow rates. Second rate that I want to talk about is the rate of greenhouse gas emissions and its effect on climate change. Now, long before there were humans, there were greenhouse gases flowing out into the atmosphere, and that's why the Earth is about 57 degrees Fahrenheit on average instead of 40 degrees, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit on average, because of those greenhouse gases. So this is the instance in which greenhouse gases are good. But about 10,000 years ago, humans started affecting the landscape with this invention called agriculture, and they were clearing all these carbon sinks, all these things that absorb carbon from the atmosphere, forests and fields. And so that, in a very small way, began to affect the composition of the atmosphere. And actually, scientists think that that has delayed the onset of an ice age. Because we should be, by all accounts, moving into the next ice age. Clearly we are not. But then 150 years ago, we discovered oil, and then natural gas, and before that coal. And our contribution to greenhouse gases skyrocketed. And it's been skyrocketing ever since. Fortunately, the Earth has been helping us by dissolving back about half of that into the oceans, into carbon sinks in the forests, and the weathering of rocks. So it would be much worse if the Earth wasn't absorbing that. But there are some indications that even that mechanism isn't going to work as well in the future. That those carbon sinks, those places in which carbon is being absorbed into the ground, into the sea, are not working as well as they used to. So I don't have to tell you that climate change is moving faster than many of the worst projections in the models for climate change had thought they would. So that's another rate that is becoming perilous to human society, not to mention all the other living things on Earth. I did bring a prop for that. And again, rates seem to be a very, very difficult thing for many people to understand, because they're usually thinking in terms of a stockpile of something. So I'm going to do a short demonstration. For this, I don't need a volunteer, but I do have this pail, which represents the atmosphere. And you'll see I've got it marked with 450, which a lot of scientists think is the upper end of what we could risk parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. And 350, which is what some scientists say we could risk. And does anybody know where we are today? 393. So those who say that we need to be at 350 are saying we need to go down. That's going to be an interesting trick. And then I mentioned all these sinks. That's the bottom. That's actually that little small opening. I'm not actually going to pour anything here because it would make such a mess. But that's the absorption that I'm talking about. So what happens, of course, is we start. Now, how am I going to do this? I'm just going to yell at you. Hang on. We're pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And a lot of people think, and some of it's coming back into those sinks, but a lot of people think, well, if we just stop right there, like that, if we just stop right there, if we hold our emissions steady, then we'll be fine. We just don't grow. Well, of course, that's nonsense, because we're already putting enough in that will allow the carbon dioxide to keep increasing in the atmosphere. It'll just keep growing. So what we have to do is cut back. And does anybody have any idea about how far we need to cut back? 50%? Any other ideas?
I think the ocean absorbs 40%, so if we go back to 60%.
Right, but the ocean isn't necessarily going to do that in the future.
Right. In terms of immediate.
Right, right. A lot of scientists are suggesting that we cut back 80% by 2050. So that means bringing that contribution way back. And there are actually a few people who say we need to cut back 110%. So, yeah, how are we going to do that? So we can't put any more in. That's what we're telling us. And then we've got to take some out. We've got to somehow figure out how to bail out the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. And that's an interesting task, and we could discuss that in more detail in the Q&A. But that's the prognosis. The third, I'll get back to my microphone. The third rate that I want to talk about is the rate of conversion, because there's a rate at which we are converting from a fossil fuel economy into an alternative energy economy. It turns out that it's not very fast. And if we're moving toward peaks in fossil fuels, we need to think about moving very quickly to an alternative energy economy. And the problem here is if we don't make it to that alternative energy infrastructure before total energy to society starts to decline, we're going to face some serious decisions. And it's not just going to be a sort of economic, technical, resource decision. It's going to be a huge political decision, because we're going to start having to decide whether we're going to take energy, that is money and resources from society, and invest it full force in alternatives because we're running out of fossil fuels, at the same time that energy is declining. And you can see that when people say, well, wait a minute, I already am suffering. I don't have, the economy is kind of depressed. I don't have as much money as I used to. And you're telling me I have to pay higher utility rates and higher taxes to subsidize the build out of this alternative energy? That's not going to get any politician elected. So this results in some real political gridlock, and I think we're actually seeing some of that gridlock already. So part of what we need to do is remember that fossil fuels are needed to build out that alternative energy infrastructure. And I want to give you, so if we have declining fossil fuels, that's going to present a real set of competitive pressures on the remaining stocks. But I want to give you an idea of what the scope and scale of the challenge is, and I did a few calculations. At current rates of installation, and you're going to get me because I said at current rates, but we're going to come back to that. At current rates of installation, if we use the nameplate capacity, that's what's listed, like a 5 megawatt wind tower, if we use that as our metric rather than operating capacity, it would take 260 years to replace the world's entire electrical generating capacity. That's just with solar, and then 110 years if we did it just with wind. Now, if we combine those two at their current rates, we'd be able to do it in 80 years, which would be okay if we had 80 years. The trouble is that the operating capacity of these is much lower than fossil fuel plants. For example, coal-fired power plants run at about 70%. Wind runs at about 30%. Solar is lower. I'm going to say that they run at about half, just for argument's sake. And so then we'd make that transition in 160 years. Now, of course, the rate of installation is going to go up, and it's going up quite dramatically. So those numbers are going to come down. But can they come down fast enough? Can we make that transition fast enough? And that's a real important issue. And I'm skeptical that if we look at this as simply a supply problem, that we're going to get to where we need to get to. And so the coming peaks in the extraction of fossil fuels and this, what I call rate of conversion problem, makes this rate of conversion problem seem unsolvable if we look at it merely as a supply problem. And that's why the next rate is the key, I think, to solving this problem, and that is the rate of consumption of energy. So what I'm going to propose is that what we need to do is bring down energy consumption by 80%. And that's a lot, 80% in 20 years. I actually think we can do that if we decided that we were going to do it. Now, I know some of you are sort of shaking your head saying this is impossible, it can't happen. How many people have been, I'm going to say two things about that. How many people have been to Europe? Okay, all right. You get in a plane, you go over the ocean, you land in the continent, you get out, and you have all these fabulous meals, and you meet all these wonderful people, at least interesting people, and you go to these museums and walk through these beautiful cities and these countrysides, and you don't even know that you are in an energy-starved society by American standards, because these people live on 1/2 of the amount of energy we use per capita. So that's what 50% looks like. And a lot of people don't come back. A lot of people stay there because the quality of life in Europe is so high. So because we have an existing example of a highly developed society that lives on half as much energy, I'm convinced that we can get down that far. So what about the other 30%? Well, the energy optimists will tell us, technology is going to save us. Technology is going to help us find all the energy that we need. But why wouldn't we be able to put all that technological prowess to work on saving us the energy that we need to save, bringing down demand? And of course, if you've been to the exhibits here at the fair, you've seen that there are a lot of people that are working on that. So I think it's possible for us to have a very high quality of life, a healthy quality of life, while bringing down dramatically our energy use. And I think it's a matter of individual will, of community will, and ultimately of political will. And there are ways for us to start right away without getting permission from somebody, without having the federal government pass a law. There's lots of ways for us to start, which I'm sure you're all familiar with and which you see on display here today.